So recently, I've been rewatching a whole lot of animated movies from a whole lot of different companies. DreamWorks, Disney, Pixar, even dead studios like Fox Animations or Blue Sky. And observing how animated films have grown and changed throughout the last 20 to 30 years, looking at what was popular, what wasn't popular, what may have been overhyped, and what films I think are underrated. And I noticed there's a startling lack of variety in animated films, particularly when it comes to box office or recognition by both industry in the form of awards and whatnot, and simply by the public. What films are popular, what films are remembered, what films did well financially. They're almost always affiliated with one of the major animated studios, or at least a studio that's affiliated with one of Hollywood's big five. Rarely does something enter the market and just catch fire out of the blue, or really make much of a mark at all without this sort of backing. Because, realistically, the backing does give them a lot of options in terms of financing and marketing. Hell, even just access to top industry talent's a major advantage. And so this brings me to the present, where I was looking through old releases of the 2000s and came across an old classic. A film I truly had not thought about in a long time. A film that really could take the title of the dankest animation that's ever been produced. And that film is, of course, Hoodwinked. And so, in a fit of nostalgia, I sat down and I watched this movie. And it wasn't quite like I remembered it. I mean, as a kid, I thought the animation looked decent. But in truth, it is in fact dog shit. But hey, I still found myself enjoying the film. But considering that this film came out in 2005, and the animation looked like it crawled out of the depths of hell, I figured, ugh, this must have bombed. And bombed hard. So imagine my surprise when I realized, as I perused Wikipedia like any good scholar, that this film is somehow one of the most lucrative and financially successful animated films of all time. This is like turning up at some random shack in the swamp and being told that this is the most expensive house on the market. You'd need a moment to digest it all. It really does beg a belief. And so this really got me to thinking. How the hell did this film manage to pull off something that feels so unlikely, that feels so impossible? How did this film manage to succeed as an independent production? No big studio. How did it manage to get such a market share at the international box office? What the hell drew crowds to this film? What made this film succeed where so many had failed? And it can't because the film's the second coming of Toy Story or something like that. It wasn't the glorious rise to power of a new giant in the animation industry. Toy Story was a revolutionary film, which was an early pioneer of 3D animation in an era where the primary market was for 2D traditional drawn animation. And yet this wasn't even close to that same standard. Unless they were trying to pioneer hideous animation, this film doesn't come close. Visually, it's dog shit, like I said. And since they had next to no money to play with, they had to make some very, very interesting decisions in terms of its style, with poor quality graphics, which were designed to imitate the style of stop motion to try and hide their cheap quality. And it didn't work, it looked god awful. And then on top of that, whilst I personally enjoy the story and the script, I think a lot of people don't. It sits on 46% on Rotten Tomatoes with a 45 out of 100 on Metacritic. The consensus being that this film is a poor man's Shrek. It doesn't hit those same highs, and its lows are a lot lower. It was designed as a made-for-DVD type of film, and you can tell. You can really tell. I mean, shit, the creators have said that unlike big studios, once their script was locked, there could be no changes. They didn't have the money. Whilst Disney can look at a film, almost finished production, and decide, well, they hate this and want to scrap it, they scrap whole sections or repurpose the project, like when Kingdom of the Sun became The Emperor's New Groove, tiny little independents can't afford that. They get one pass, one shot. So really, this film is the first version, as opposed to Disney films where they'll likely cycle through a number of different versions, making tweaks here and there to make the story better and improve the narrative flow. So this means the film didn't have that same opportunity to be good. So what the hell is it about this film that allowed it to perform so far out of its league? And I sat down and thought about it, and honestly I think there's a range of reasons that sort of cascade into each other. The first one, of course, is its genre. In 2001, we saw the release of what is probably DreamWorks' most iconic and enduring film, Shrek. Coming off the heels of the Disney Renaissance, which firmly entrenched epic musicals and fairy tales as the popular style for animated films to follow, Shrek went in a bit of a different direction and moved towards parodying those types of films. And to put it simply, Shrek blew up and created a hunger for parody. Films that take the stories you know and love and flip them on their head, that challenge tropes and stereotypes, that aren't afraid to make fun of works that have been made before, that aren't afraid to go against the status quo. And then this was followed up with Shrek 2, which proved that this hunger had grown even more fierce, as it grossed significantly more than the first film, and we started to see various different studios take the plunge and try to replicate DreamWorks' success to varied results. So clearly, there was an interest in these style of films that was especially prevalent in the early to mid 2000s, and Hoodwinked came out right in the middle of all that hype, and thus, I think it got kind of swept up in all of it. And I think it helped on top of that Disney was in the midst of their latest dark age, where they were simply throwing ideas at the wall, hoping something would stick, whilst Pixar and DreamWorks really started to take control of the market. Thus, there was a brief moment in time where there was a little bit of extra space for another studio or film to have a crack at making it in the big leagues. So that, combined with the fact that the genre was really hot at the time, it got audiences excited and interested. And not only that, it got producers and executives excited and interested too. Because as the film neared the end of production, it began screening to various different distribution companies who would facilitate its release in cinemas and help it get a much bigger audience. And obviously, since the script was, it was decent, I don't think it was bad, and the genre was the exact thing that caught fire in the animated world at the time, there was a shit ton of interest from a lot of different parties. And one of these parties was the Weinstein Company. Yes, those Weinsteins. Ugh. But yeah, they were actually a contributing factor to the film's success. Sorry to say. After all, the Weinsteins were the founders of Miramax Pictures, which was acquired by Disney during the 90s, with the brothers staying on board during that time. Eventually, during the mid-2000s, they left and formed the Weinstein Company, and after being made aware of this film, they decided to pursue it in order to get one over on Disney by entering the animated market. Guess they didn't end on great terms. I wonder why. Anyway, terrible man that he may be, Harvey did know his movies. And he had contacts too, so the film got more exposure, and a lot of roles were recast with much more prominent actors to attract more attention and get a better audience turnout. And I mean, it's pretty clear that this strategy did indeed work, because it ended up doing well at the box office relative to its size and independent status, and brought in a shit ton of money, grossing $110 million off a budget of around $8 million according to reports. So yeah, that's a pretty big profit. A much bigger profit than most movies manage, especially when you factor in how much the big studios then go on to spend on marketing and whatnot. I mean, it made over 13 times its budget. That's an absolute win for any studio. And perhaps it would have been a disappointment in any other circumstance. After all, $110 million compared to the billions that some other studios get isn't much. But the big factor that's now in play is the fact that the budget was next to nothing at all. And so when it then got the backing of bigger and more well-connected and funded companies, a film that reeked of straight to DVD was able to get bigger names and hit the cinemas instead, and actually reap significant rewards from that. Because they were independent and being financed by one or two backers for what seemed to be a bucket list project, they were left with a largely shoestring budget. Studios like Disney have investors and financial backers that are in contact with the producers to fund the films. And by this stage, the mid-2000s, studios like Disney had a lot of goodwill and proven success that would give people confidence in supporting the studio, the same with Pixar or DreamWorks. The studios have the confidence of the financial sector, or at least more confidence than a tiny, no-name independent company that's been established pretty much to make this film. Thus, the lack of money. And thus, the quality of the film was much lesser than it would have been, but this in turn allowed for these immense, insane profit margins. A ridiculously high box office gross comparative to what could have been expected. A gross that allowed this dated, strange, ugly film to carve out its own place in the annals of history and cement its legacy against literally all the odds to become one of the most successful and lucrative animated films of all time. A once-in-a-lifetime achievement that will honestly never be repeated now that the animated box office is once again being dominated by the big studios, many of whom are firing on all cylinders. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I would like to say that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of Hoodwinked if you've seen it? Like it? Hate it? Surprised it did so well? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.